Good day, everyone. On behalf of our group, we are going to present a case study in the 2011 Tohoku, Japan earthquake and tsunami. So, our presentation outline is as follows. This is based on the guidance provided, and first, we will be briefly tackling the source of disruption, followed by the immediate impacts, the system of inequalities, and power differentials. Next, the various actors' responses, the empowered and disempowered sectors, and finally, the outcome of the disaster. Moving forward, what is the source of the disruption in this following case? On March 11, 2011, Japan experienced the strongest earthquake to be recorded in its history with a strong magnitude of 9.0. This was followed by a tsunami reaching over 40 meters and had devastated over 200 square miles of coastal land. Following the earthquake, the tsunami that it caused disabled the power supply and cooling of three Fukushima Daiichi reactors. The immediate impacts were one, a nuclear accident where three reactors overheated, melting their cores to some degree, and resulted in radioactive contamination over a large area of Japan. Second, the high cost of destruction, with more than 123,000 houses destroyed and damaged to almost a million more. 98% of the damage was attributed to the tsunami. More than this, there were 450,000 people becoming homeless and 20,000 people who were reported to be dead or missing. Within a week, a nuclear emergency was declared. There were more than 1 million households with no water, and the majority of 270,000 persons within the nuclear evacuation zone were evacuated. Now, we move forward to the systems of inequalities and power differentials that may have aggravated or mitigated the impacts of the disasters. First, we'll look into the economy of Japan. It has aided the country to implement a comprehensive disaster risk management plan, as the country is prone to disasters and earthquakes. However, implementing measures entail a big amount of budget. Being one of the largest economies in the world, Japan has successfully implemented these measures, which help mitigate the impacts of the earthquake and tsunami. Followed by the disaster preparedness, which is related to economy of Japan. By investing on both structural and non-structural measures, the country was able to mitigate the impacts of the said disaster. These have been complemented by their culture of preparedness by series of training and evacuation drills within institutions and local governments. The country also had an effective legislation, implementation, and regulation of its policies. However, there was a lack of coordination mechanisms between actors to act on the ground. The coordination mechanisms between local governments, civil society organizations, private entities, and the central government were not as optimal as they should have been. Next, we will be tackling the how various actors responded to the disruption. First, we have the state, from state authorities to formal institutions. One of the primary actors in this disruption and response was the government of Japan, which held a national committee for emergency management headed by the prime minister. Second, the Ministry of Health, who was in charge for preparing suitable vehicles for supplying water and assigning hospitals for remedy of casualties and people who have been exposed to radiation. Next, the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries with the Ministry of Finance, who was responsible for providing food, portable toilet, blanket, and other essential things as a response to the disruption. We also have the Japanese Red Crescent Society, or JRC, who played an important role in initial relief operations and temporary housing. This society adapted its operations to all other rescue organizations and NGOs, which were deployed to the area later. Lastly, for the state actors, the Japan Meteorological Agency was in charge of monitoring and observing earthquake and tsunami occurrences. Moving forward to the private sector, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction's Arise Japan was established in 2015. It aims to raise awareness among private sectors in the adoption of the Sendai framework. IBM also played a key role in the response during this disruption. They helped address issues of food security by providing a campaign for public awareness regarding safety of food products from Date City, one of the cities near the Fukushima nuclear meltdown. Now we have Joseph to talk about the civil society communities that address the problem.
Okay, so for the civil society organizations, there are quite a few prominent organizations that played a significant role in the response to this disaster. First is the Saddleback Church, where they rallied small groups to engage local churches as relief centers, and they also linked with public and private partners to help provide various relief services such as physical, emotional, and spiritual support. And they also aim to empower survivors and fund what's overlooked by the general response by the government. Next is Save the Children. They sent emergency response teams to assess the needs of children and their families in the hardest hit areas between Miyagi Prefecture and Tokyo in Japan. Next is American Red Cross, where they sent a disaster management expert for a week long mission where she worked with Japanese Red Cross in order to bring relief to affected communities. Next is the International Medical Corps, an on the ground emergency response team in charge of assessing post disaster conditions and prepping critical supplies for delivery to the earthquake zone. They focused on the affected communities that have not yet been reached by the response of other organizations and the government as well. Last for civil society is USAID, where they deployed their urban search and rescue teams to assist in the rescue effort in the aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami. The teams are composed of 150 personnel and 12 canines that are trained to detect live victims. And they arrived in Misawa, Japan, where they began the search with both Japanese and international search and rescue teams. So, in this disaster, very few sectors are empowered. And here are a few of the sectors that were empowered after the unfortunate event. First are the civil society organizations. Civil society organizations are supposed to complement the actions and the plans of the government. They also aim to fill in the gaps left by the government's response. Moreover, they are also responsible for handling the volunteers and the coordination of several relief operations of both Japanese and international organizations. Among the most prominent and empowered civil society organizations following this disaster was the Japan Platform. The Japan Platform set into motion the funding of several relief efforts just a few hours after the earthquake had occurred. They funded organizations that were to oversee the initial needs, assessment, rehabilitation, healthcare, hygiene, and other forms of humanitarian support. On the other hand, local governments are given the job to initiate the disaster response as they see fit. They also forge disaster relief agreements with other localities. For example, the Japanese earthquake and tsunami saw officials from unaffected areas being deployed to the prefectures of Miyagi, Iwate, and Fukushima, the three prefectures that were heavily affected by the disaster. They were deployed by their respective prefectures in order to provide support for the affected communities. Next, please. Okay, so for the disempowered sectors, as mentioned earlier, are Miyagi, Fukushima, and Iwate prefectures. These are the three most affected by the disaster. So for the Miyagi prefecture is the closest to the epicenter of the earthquake and the tsunami. Approximately 49,675 businesses and 171,777 employees were affected. For the Fukushima prefecture, it's the second most affected prefecture, where approximately 27,627 businesses and 105,264 employees were affected by the calamity. And lastly is the Iwate prefecture, the third most affected prefecture, where approximately 8,537 businesses and 33,742 employees were affected. So in Fukushima, there was a forced evacuation due to the nuclear meltdown, emitted radiation, which forced the government to identify an exclusion zone, and approximately 150,000 people were forced to evacuate. Another problem that they had to face was unemployment, because residents working within the exclusion zone were forced to move to other cities for employment. And lastly, skill mismatch. Since the evacuees are coming from a rural area, residents were used to agriculture and fishing for their livelihood. Transferring to other cities forced them to learn other occupations to survive. So the outcome of the disruption for the Central Council for Accident Prevention, a council that educated the public on natural disasters. Thus, when the alarm for earthquakes and tsunamis were sounded, people are trained on the necessary procedures and steps that have to be done in an event that an earthquake and a tsunami happens. And then Japan social capital. Japan has a high respect of citizens to roles, moral values, and their solidarity. The idea of prioritizing public benefits dominated over their self-interest. Another outcome is decreased reliance on atomic power. After the calamity, the reliance on atomic power for electricity dropped from 30% before the meltdown to only about 3 to 5% now. It also had an effect on gender equality and empowerment of women. Participation of women in sectors like agriculture, forestry, and fishery were promoted. And it was also lobbied for 30% membership of women in committees that were for formulating master plans in agriculture and other government responses also. And lastly, the Act on the Development of a Tsunami Resilient City was brought about since Japan had a lot of policies that were targeted towards the occurrences of earthquakes, while laws that governed the procedures and the protocol following a tsunami were non-existent. So in this case, an act was legislated and they set up policies and enhanced research systems and facilities and tsunami education and evacuation in relation to the Central Council for Accident Prevention, so that the Japanese residents are more informed and more ready for such disaster. So that would be all for our group today. Thank you very much.